How far would you go when your own family member is left shattered by powerful people who believe the law doesn't apply to them? I only came to fish at sunrise, but what I found by the lake's edge changed everything. They thought they could buy silence and erase my son's suffering, never imagining what a quiet man, with the right connections and the law firmly on his side, could actually do. The alarm buzzed at 4:30 a.m., but I was already awake. Franklin Mercer, frank to everyone who mattered, didn't need much sleep these days. At 52, my body had learned to function on coffee and determination. The fishing gear was already loaded in my truck from the night before: tackle box, cooler, and my grandfather's old rod that had never let me down. The drive to Clearwater Lake took 20 minutes through winding back roads that most folks had forgotten existed. That's how I liked it. The old logging road was my secret, a place where a blue-collar supervisor could think without phones ringing or problems demanding immediate solutions. My wife Maggie always said I did my best thinking with a line in the water. The headlights cut through the pre-dawn darkness as I navigated the familiar curves. Pine trees pressed close to the narrow asphalt, their branches creating a tunnel that opened onto the lake's edge. I'd been coming here for 15 years, ever since we'd moved to the county. It was my sanctuary. But something was wrong. A dark shape lay crumpled beside the road, maybe 50 yards from my usual parking spot. I slowed the truck, squinting through the windshield. At first, I thought it might be a deer. We saw plenty of animals struck on these remote stretches. But as my headlights swept across the form, I caught sight of fabric. Human fabric. I slammed the brakes and threw the truck into park, leaving the engine running and the lights on. My boots hit the gravel as I ran, my pulse pounding as I closed the distance. "Oh my God," I whispered. It was Evan, my son, my 22-year-old boy who'd inherited my stubborn jaw and his mother's kind eyes. Those eyes were swollen shut now, his face marked with deep, dark bruising under the harsh glare of my headlights. His clothes were torn and caked with mud, and a spreading stain soaked through his shirt, far more than anyone should ever lose. "Evan!" I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands hovering over his body, afraid to touch him and cause more damage. "Son, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, and a groan escaped his split lips. "Dad? I'm here. I'm right here. What happened? Who did this to you?" Evan tried to sit up, but I gently pressed him back down. His breathing was labored, and I could see the pain etched in every line of his face. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, thick with shame and something that might have been fear. "It was them, Dad. Richard and Blake. Natalie's father and brother." The words hit me like a physical blow. Richard Porter, the multi-millionaire real estate developer who owned half the county. Blake Porter, his spoiled son who drove a different luxury car every month. They'd made it clear from the beginning that they didn't approve of their daughter dating beneath her station. But I'd never imagined they'd resort to this. They said... Evan's voice cracked. "They said I wasn't good enough for her, that I needed to learn my place." I felt something cold and dangerous unfurl in my chest. Not rage, not yet. Something quieter and more focused, something that had been building every time Richard Porter looked through me at family dinners, every time Blake made his snide comments about working-class values. "We need to get you to a hospital," I said, already reaching for my phone. "Dad, they said if I told anyone, let me worry about that." I was surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "Right now, we need to get you medical attention." The ambulance arrived in 12 minutes, followed closely by a sheriff's deputy who took a brief statement and promised to follow up. As the paramedics loaded Evan into the ambulance, I caught a glimpse of his injuries in the harsh, fluorescent light: broken ribs, possibly internal bleeding, and bruises that would take weeks to heal. At Riverside County Hospital, Dr. Lionel White, an old friend from my union days, took personal charge of Evan's care. While my son underwent X-rays and CT scans, I sat in the waiting room trying to process what had happened. The porters had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Mr. Mercer?" A woman in an expensive suit approached me, her smile as artificial as her pearls. "I'm Patricia Valdez, Mr. Porter's assistant. He asked me to convey his concern about your son's accident." "Accident?" I kept my voice level, but something in my tone made her take a step back. "Yes, well, these things happen. Young men can be so reckless. Mr. Porter wanted you to know that he's prepared to cover all medical expenses, of course, as a gesture of goodwill." She slid an envelope across the table between us. Through the paper, I could see the outline of a check, a substantial one, judging by the thickness. He also wanted me to mention that sometimes it's best to let sleeping dogs lie. No point in making a difficult situation worse for everyone involved. I stared at the envelope for a long moment, then looked up at her. "Tell Mr. Porter that my son's medical expenses are covered by our insurance, and tell him that some dogs don't sleep as deeply as he might think." Her smile faltered. "Mr. Mercer, I don't think you understand the gravity." "I understand perfectly." I stood up, leaving the envelope on the table. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to be with my son." As she hurried away, her heels clicking on the hospital's polished floor, I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a familiar number. Carter McClellan, my cousin, my childhood partner in mischief, and now a detective with the county sheriff's office. The phone rang twice before his gravelly voice answered. "Frank, it's awful early for a social call." "Carter, I need to see you. Today. It's about Evan." There was a pause. Carter had been a cop long enough to read between the lines. "How bad?" "Bad enough that the Porters sent their lawyer to the hospital with hush money." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll be there in an hour. Don't do anything stupid until I arrive." "I'm not going to do anything stupid, cousin. But I am going to do something." As I hung up, a text message chimed on my phone. The number was unknown, but the message was crystal clear. "Your boy should have listened. Next time will be worse." I screenshotted the message and saved it to a new folder on my phone. Evidence. Because if the Porters thought they could intimidate Franklin Mercer into silence, they were about to learn just how wrong they could be. Carter arrived at the hospital looking every inch the seasoned detective he'd become. At 48, he still carried himself with the confidence of the high school quarterback he'd once been, but his eyes held the wariness of someone who'd seen too much of humanity's dark side. We found a quiet corner of the cafeteria where we could talk without interruption. "Start from the beginning," he said, pulling out a small notebook that looked well worn from years of use. I told him everything. Finding Evan on the logging road, the threatening text, Patricia Valdez's visit with the hush money. Carter listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in his precise handwriting. "How long has this been building?" he asked when I finished. "Since Evan started dating Natalie 2 years ago." I rubbed my temples, feeling the weight of accumulated slights and insults. At first it was just subtle things, comments about different backgrounds and life experiences. Richard Porter has a way of making you feel small without saying anything directly offensive. I remembered the first time we'd been invited to the Porter estate for dinner. Maggie had spent a week's salary on a new dress, and I'd worn my best suit, the one I saved for funerals and job interviews. The house was a monument to wealth. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and artwork that probably cost more than my annual salary. Richard Porter had greeted us at the door with the kind of smile politicians used on voters they'd never see again. "Frank, so glad you could make it. Natalie's told us so much about Evan's family." The pause before family had been barely perceptible, but it was there. A subtle reminder that we were visitors in their world, not equals. Throughout dinner, the conversation had danced around topics designed to highlight the differences between us. Richard spoke casually about his yacht, his vacation home in the Hamptons, his golf games with state senators. When he asked about my work, it was with the kind of polite interest people showed when discussing the weather. "Supervisory position at the plant, isn't it?" he'd said, cutting into his prime rib with surgical precision. "That must be satisfying. There's something to be said for honest work." Again, that pause, that subtle emphasis that transformed a compliment into something that felt like condescension. Blake had been worse. At 24, he had all of his father's arrogance with none of the polish that came from years of business dealings. He made no effort to hide his disdain for Evan, referring to him as Nat's charity case when he thought no one was listening. "I mean, what do they even talk about?" I'd overheard him saying to a friend at Natalie's birthday party last year. "What does a guy who changes oil for a living have in common with someone who's studying international relations at Georgetown?" Evan worked part-time at a garage to help pay for his community college classes, but Blake made it sound like he was some kind of grease monkey with no ambition. The truth was that my son was working toward his associate degree in business, while holding down a job and maintaining a relationship with a girl who lived in a different world. "The threats started about 6 months ago," I told Carter. "Nothing direct at first. Richard offered to help Evan find better opportunities in other states. Blake started showing up at places where Evan worked or studied, just to remind him that he was being watched." Carter's pen stopped moving. "You have any proof of that?" "Evan mentioned it, but he didn't want to make waves. He was afraid it would cause problems for Natalie." "What about the girl? Where does she stand in all this?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with an incoming text. The name on the screen made me smile for the first time since finding Evan on the road. Natalie Porter. "Mr. Mercer, I heard about Evan. Can we meet? I have something you need to see." I showed the message to Carter, who raised an eyebrow. "Interesting timing." "Natalie's not like the rest of them," I said. "She's been fighting her family about Evan from the beginning. Smart girl, studying international relations with plans for law school. She sees right through her father and brother's act." An hour later, I met Natalie at a small cafe near Georgetown University. At 20, she had the kind of natural beauty that didn't need enhancement, but today she looked exhausted. Her usually perfect blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her eyes were red from crying. "Mr. Mercer, I'm so sorry." The words tumbled out before I'd even sat down. I tried to stop them. I threatened to cut all ties with the family, but they said they were just going to have a conversation with Evan. "This wasn't a conversation, Natalie." "I know." She pulled out her phone with shaking hands. "That's why I asked you to meet me. I recorded some things. I was afraid something like this might happen." She played the first recording. Richard Porter's voice was clear and unmistakable. "The boy needs to understand that some doors aren't meant for people like him. If he won't listen to reason, perhaps he'll respond to a more direct approach." Blake's voice joined his father's. "I know some guys who could explain things in terms he'd understand. Nothing permanent, just enough to get the message across." "When was this recorded?" I asked. 3 days ago. There's more." The second recording was even more damning. Blake talking to someone on the phone. "Yeah, the logging road by Clearwater Lake. Make sure he understands this is just a warning. Next time won't be so gentle." I felt that cold, focused anger growing stronger. They hadn't just attacked my son. They'd planned it, discussed it like a business transaction. "Natalie, you know what this means, don't you? If you come forward with these recordings, your family will never forgive you." She met my eyes with a steadiness that reminded me why Evan had fallen for her. "Mr. Mercer, they stopped being my family the moment they put their hands on Evan. I love your son, and I love the man he's becoming. If my father and brother can't see that, then they're not the people I thought they were." As I drove back to the hospital, I thought about the recordings on Natalie's phone and the text message I'd received. The Porters had made 2 critical mistakes. They'd underestimated how much their own daughter despised their methods, and they'd assumed that Franklin Mercer would roll over and accept their version of justice, They were about to learn how wrong they were on both counts. Carter's home office was a study in organized chaos. Case files covered every available surface, and the walls were lined with commendations, family photos, and a map of the county marked with colored pins that represented ongoing investigations. He poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration. "Let me hear those recordings again," he said, settling into his chair. I played Natalie's audio files on speaker, watching Carter's expression grow more serious with each word. When Richard Porter's voice discussed direct approaches and Blake mentioned the logging road, Carter's jaw tightened. This is a coordinated plan to cause serious harm, possibly rising to a much more severe charge depending on Evan's condition. He made notes in a fresh file folder labeled with Evan's name. "But you know how this works, Frank. The Porters have money and lawyers. Very good ones. They'll argue the recordings were misleading or manipulated." "What about the text message?" "Threatening communication, but it came from an unknown number. Their lawyers will say anyone could have sent it." Carter leaned back in his chair, studying the ceiling tiles as if they held answers. "We need more. Something that ties them directly to the attack, or evidence of a pattern of behavior." "What kind of pattern?" "The kind that shows this wasn't a one-off. Powerful people like Richard Porter don't usually start with something this extreme. They escalate over time." Carter's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. "Speaking of which, I might have something. Paula Ruiz has been working financial crimes for the past 6 months. Porter's name has come up in connection with some questionable land deals." Detective Paula Ruiz turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s, with the kind of focused intensity that made witnesses confess before they realized they were guilty. She arrived at Carter's house carrying a thick file folder and wearing the expression of someone who'd found something interesting. "Franklin Mercer?" She shook my hand with a firm grip. "Carter's told me about your situation. I'm sorry about your son." "What do you have on Porter?" Carter asked without preamble. Paula opened her file and spread several documents across Carter's desk. "Richard Porter's been buying up property around Clearwater Lake for the past 3 years, paying well above market value, which raised some flags with the county assessor's office." She pointed to a map marked with red circles. "Turns out he's been using shell companies to hide the purchases. The plan is to build a luxury resort, but he's been telling the Environmental Commission that the land will remain undeveloped." "That's fraud," I said. "That's just the beginning." Paula pulled out another set of documents. "He's been bribing county commissioners to fast-track zoning changes. We have bank records showing payments to 3 different officials, all disguised as consulting fees." Carter whistled low. "How much are we talking about?" $2.7 million in bribes over 18 months. The resort project is worth about $50 million when completed." I stared at the documents, pieces clicking together in my mind. The logging road where I found Evan, that's part of the land Porter's trying to develop. "Exactly." Paula's eyes lit up with the satisfaction of a hunter who'd found fresh tracks. "And here's the interesting part. Your son's attack happened 3 days after Evan mentioned to Natalie that he'd seen surveying equipment near the lake. Equipment that wasn't supposed to be there according to Porter's environmental filings." The implications hit me like a sledgehammer. They didn't just beat him up because of classism. They beat him up because he was a witness to their fraud. "That's my theory," Paula said. "But proving it will take time. Financial crimes move slowly through the system." "How much time?" I asked. Carter and Paula exchanged glances. 6 months, maybe more, Carter said. "These guys have expensive lawyers and political connections. They'll drag it out as long as possible." I thought about Evan lying in that hospital bed, about the threatening text message, about Richard Porter's smug confidence that his money could buy silence. 6 months was too long. The Porters would use that time to cover their tracks and intimidate witnesses. "There might be another way," I said slowly, "something more immediate." Carter raised an eyebrow. "I don't like the sound of that." "Nothing illegal, I assured him. But Porter's built his reputation on being a pillar of the community. What happens to that reputation when the community learns what kind of man he really is? Paula leaned forward. What are you thinking? The annual county charity gala. It's in 2 weeks. Porter's the main sponsor, and he's receiving some kind of humanitarian award. 500 of the county's most influential people will be there, plus local media. Carter was already shaking his head. Frank, you can't just walk into a gala and start making accusations. I'm not talking about accusations. I'm talking about evidence, recordings, documents, witness testimony, all presented at the moment when Porter thinks he's untouchable. That's... Paula paused, considering. Actually, that's not a terrible idea. Public pressure might force the DA to move faster on the criminal charges. It's also dangerous, Carter warned. Porter won't just roll over. He'll fight back, and he has resources we don't. I thought about that for a moment, then pulled out my phone and called Natalie. She answered on the second ring. Mr. Mercer, how's Evan? He's stable. Listen, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are you willing to go public with what you know about your father and brother? There was a long pause. When Natalie spoke again, her voice was steady and determined. What do you need me to do? After I hung up, Carter shook his head. You're really going to do this. They crossed the line when they put my son in the hospital, I said. Now they're going to learn what happens when you mess with a family that doesn't stay bought. Paula gathered her documents. I'll keep digging into the financial crimes. Maybe I can find something that will stick regardless of what happens at the gala. As I drove home that evening, I noticed a black sedan following me at a discreet distance. It stayed behind me for several miles before turning off onto a side road. The message was clear. The Porters were watching. Let them watch. They were about to discover that Franklin Mercer could be just as patient and methodical as they were. The difference was that I had truth on my side, and truth had a way of surfacing when you least expected it. The next morning, I found an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. Evan's car in the hospital parking lot with all 4 tires slashed. I added the photo to my growing evidence file and called Carter. The Porters wanted to play intimidation games? Fine. But they were playing against someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The war had begun. The manila envelope Carter had left in my mailbox contained more than I'd expected. Along with copies of Natalie's recordings and the threatening text message, there were property deeds, bank transfer records, and a series of photographs showing surveying equipment near Clearwater Lake, equipment that wasn't supposed to exist according to Porter's environmental impact statements. I spread everything across my kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle. Maggie brought me coffee and studied the documents with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 25 years as a nurse, accustomed to reading between the lines and spotting inconsistencies. This is bigger than what happened to Evan, she said, pointing to a bank transfer record showing a payment to County Commissioner Harold Fitzgerald. They've been buying officials for years. That's what makes it perfect, I replied. Porter thinks he's untouchable because he's got half the county government in his pocket. But that same corruption is what's going to bring him down. My phone rang. Carter's name appeared on the screen. Frank, you need to get down to the sheriff's office. Paula found something big. 30 minutes later, I was sitting in a conference room with Carter and Paula, looking at a computer screen displaying bank records that made my head spin. Numbers with lots of zeros, shell companies with names like Clearwater Development LLC and Pine Ridge Holdings, and a web of transactions that would have made a money launderer proud. Porter's been funneling money through 6 different companies, Paula explained, using a laser pointer to highlight specific entries on the screen. The resort project is just the tip of the iceberg. He's been manipulating property values throughout the county, buying low through intermediaries, and then getting his pet commissioners to approve zoning changes that increase values by 300%. How much money are we talking about? I asked. Conservative estimate? 40 million in fraudulent gains over the past 5 years. Carter whistled. That's federal territory, wire fraud, racketeering, maybe RICO charges. Which brings me to the interesting part, Paula continued. The FBI has been watching Porter for 8 months. They're building a case, but they need more evidence to make it stick. I felt a chill run down my spine. Are you saying the feds know about what happened to Evan? No, but they're very interested in what we've uncovered. Assault and intimidation of potential witnesses? That's exactly the kind of behavior that helps establish a pattern of criminal enterprise. Paula handed me a business card. Special Agent Miranda Cross wants to meet with you and Natalie, unofficially for now. That afternoon, I met Agent Cross at a coffee shop 20 miles outside the county. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made you choose your words carefully. She listened to my story without interruption, occasionally making notes in a leather portfolio. Mr. Mercer, I want to be clear about something, she said when I finished. The Bureau takes witness intimidation very seriously, especially when it's connected to ongoing financial crimes, but building a federal case takes time. How much time? Minimum 6 months, possibly a year. I shook my head. Agent Cross, with respect, my son is lying in a hospital bed with broken ribs and internal injuries. The people who did this to him sent me a photo of his slashed tires yesterday. I don't have a year to wait for justice. She studied me for a moment. What are you planning to do? I told her about the charity gala, about my plan to present the evidence publicly. She listened with the expression of someone watching a train wreck in slow motion. That's inadvisable, she said finally. Public exposure could compromise our investigation. Or it could force Porter to make mistakes that help your investigation, I countered. Desperate people do desperate things. Agent Cross closed her portfolio. Mr. Mercer, I can't officially endorse your plan, but I can't stop you either. Just be aware that once you go public, there's no going back. Porter will use every resource at his disposal to destroy you and your family. He already tried to destroy my family. Now it's my turn. That evening, I met with Natalie at a small restaurant near her campus. She looked nervous but determined, clutching a flash drive like it contained state secrets. I got into my father's home office, she said without preamble. He keeps backup files of everything on a private server, financial records, communications with commissioners, even recordings of phone calls. She slid the flash drive across the table. It's all there, Mr. Mercer. Everything you need to prove what they've been doing. Natalie, you know what this means. Once this comes out, your family will disown you. You'll lose your trust fund, your inheritance, everything. She met my eyes with the same steady determination I'd seen before. Mr. Mercer, I've been thinking about that. My father always told me that money can't buy happiness, but it can buy freedom. Well, I've decided that some freedoms are too expensive. I pocketed the flash drive. What about your mother? Will she stand with you? Natalie's expression softened. Mom's been pretending not to see what Dad and Blake really are for years. But she loves me, and deep down, she knows this is wrong. When the truth comes out, I think she'll make the right choice. The next morning, I received an unexpected visitor. Richard Porter himself stood on my front porch, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit and wearing the kind of confident smile that came from a lifetime of getting his way. Frank, I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced. His tone was friendly, but his eyes held the warmth of a snake. I wanted to check on Evan personally. Such a terrible accident. It wasn't an accident, and we both know it. His smile never wavered. Frank, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Young men can be so impulsive, so prone to exaggeration. I'm sure if we sat down and discussed this rationally, we could reach an understanding. What kind of understanding? Porter reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. I've been thinking about Evan's future. A bright young man like that deserves opportunities. I know people at several excellent universities, places where he could really make something of himself. Full scholarships, of course. He set the envelope on my porch railing. There's also the matter of his medical expenses, lost wages, pain, and suffering. I believe $50,000 would be more than fair compensation for his accident. I looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. And all I have to do is forget what really happened. Frank, you seem like a reasonable man, a practical man. You know how the world works. Sometimes it's better to focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past. You're right about one thing, I said. I am a practical man. Practical enough to know that men like you don't offer $50,000 unless they're afraid of losing $50 million. Porter's smile finally slipped. Frank, I hope you're not considering doing anything unwise. This county is a small place. People talk. Reputations matter. It would be unfortunate if your family found themselves isolated. The threat was delivered with the same friendly tone he'd used to offer the bribe, but the message was clear. I stepped closer to him, close enough to see my reflection in his expensive sunglasses. Mr. Porter, let me be clear about something. You put my son in the hospital. You've threatened my family. You think your money makes you untouchable. I paused, letting the words sink in. You're about to learn how wrong you are. Porter's composure cracked slightly. For just a moment, I saw something that might have been uncertainty flicker across his face. Then the mask slipped back into place. Frank, I hope you'll reconsider. For everyone's sake. As his luxury sedan pulled away from my house, I picked up the envelope he'd left behind. Inside was a check for $50,000 and a handwritten note. This offer expires after the charity gala. I took a photo of the check and the note, then added them to my evidence file. Porter had just made another mistake. He'd confirmed that he knew exactly when and how I planned to expose him. The countdown to the gala had begun. In 5 days, Richard Porter would stand before 500 of the county's most influential citizens to receive an award for his humanitarian contributions. He had no idea that the same stage would become the platform for his downfall. The week before the gala passed in a blur of careful preparation. I took vacation days from the plant, telling my supervisor I needed to be with Evan during his recovery. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did spend hours at the hospital, but I also used the time to organize evidence and coordinate with Carter and Paula. Dr. Lionel White provided detailed medical reports documenting Evan's injuries. The photographs were particularly damning, bruises and patterns consistent with being kicked while down, defensive wounds on his hands and forearms, and internal injuries that could have been fatal if I hadn't found him when I did. Frank, I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, Dr. White said, as he handed me the sealed envelope containing the reports. This wasn't a fight between young men. This was a methodical beating designed to send a message. Will you testify to that if needed? Absolutely. What happened to your boy was a deliberate attempt to cause serious harm, no matter what high-priced lawyers might try to call it. Carter had been busy as well. Working with Paula, he'd mapped out the connections between Porter's shell companies and the county commissioners who'd approved his zoning requests. The pattern was clear. Porter would purchase land through intermediaries, bribe officials to change zoning laws, then develop properties worth millions more than he'd paid. The beautiful thing about financial crimes, Paula explained during one of our meetings, is that rich guys always keep detailed records. They can't help themselves. Porter documented every bribe, every illegal transaction, probably because he needed the records for tax purposes. How ironic would it be if he goes down for tax evasion like Al Capone? Carter mused. But it was Natalie who provided the most crucial piece of evidence. The files she'd copied from her father's private server contained not just financial records, but audio recordings of phone conversations between Porter and various county officials. In one particularly damning recording, Porter could be heard explicitly discussing the need to eliminate the witness problem regarding Evan's knowledge of the illegal surveying work. My father records everything, Natalie explained when she delivered the final batch of files. He says you never know when you might need leverage over someone. I guess he never considered that someone might use his own recordings against him. 3 days before the gala, I received a visit from Natalie's mother, Clara Porter. She arrived at my house in a modest sedan rather than one of the family's luxury vehicles, and she looked like she'd aged years in the past week. "Mr. Mercer, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion," she said when I opened the door. "I needed to speak with you privately." I invited her in, and Maggie served coffee in our small living room. Clara Porter looked out of place among our modest furniture, but she seemed more comfortable than she had at any of the family gatherings I'd attended. "I want you to know that I had no knowledge of what Richard and Blake were planning," she began. "If I had known—" "Mrs. Porter, you don't need to explain anything to me." "Yes, I do." Her voice was firm, and for the first time, I could see where Natalie had inherited her strength. "I've spent 25 years pretending not to see what my husband really is." I told myself that his business methods were just aggressive, that his treatment of people was just confidence. She set down her coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly. "But when Natalie told me what really happened to your son, I couldn't pretend anymore. What they did was monstrous." "What are you going to do about it?" Clara Porter straightened her shoulders. "I'm going to testify against my own husband if necessary, and I'm going to make sure Natalie doesn't lose everything for doing the right thing." She reached into her purse and pulled out a legal document. "I've established a trust fund for Natalie that Richard can't touch. Whatever happens at the gala, whatever happens afterward, she'll be financially secure." I was impressed despite myself. Clara Porter had more steel in her spine than anyone had given her credit for. "There's something else," she continued. "Richard is planning something for the gala. I don't know what, but he's been meeting with private security consultants and making phone calls at odd hours. He knows you're going to be there, and he's preparing for it." "What kind of preparation?" "I don't know specifics, but I overheard him telling Blake that the problem would be handled permanently after the gala. Mr. Mercer, I think you and your family might be in danger." That evening, I called Carter and Paula to discuss security arrangements. We decided that I would wear a wire to the gala and that several off-duty officers would be present in case things went wrong. Agent Cross, working unofficially, arranged for FBI surveillance of the Porter estate and business offices. "Frank, I want you to understand something," Carter said, as we tested the recording equipment. "Once you step onto that stage tomorrow night, there's no going back. Porter will use every weapon at his disposal to destroy you." "He already destroyed my son's trust in justice," I replied. "Tomorrow night, we restore the balance." The morning of the gala, I visited Evan at the hospital. He was healing well, but the bruises on his face served as a constant reminder of what the Porters were capable of. "Dad, are you sure about this?" he asked as I adjusted his pillows. "These people have money and power. What if they find a way to turn this around on us?" "Son, your great-grandfather used to tell me that a man's measure isn't determined by how hard he can hit, but by how hard he can get hit and keep moving forward." I squeezed his shoulder gently. "The Porters hit us hard. Tonight, we show them that the Mercer family doesn't stay down." Natalie arrived as I was preparing to leave. She looked beautiful in a simple black dress, but her eyes held the nervousness of someone about to walk into battle. "Mr. Mercer, I've been thinking about what my father might do when the truth comes out. He's not going to just accept defeat gracefully." "I know. That's why we're prepared for whatever comes next." She nodded, then surprised me by giving me a hug. "Thank you for fighting for Evan, for fighting for us." As I drove home to get ready for the gala, I thought about the events that had led to this moment. A week ago, I'd been a simple man planning to spend a quiet morning fishing. Tonight, I would stand before the county's elite and expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of local government. The Porters had made one critical error in their calculations. They'd assumed that Franklin Mercer would be intimidated by their wealth and power. They'd never considered that a man with nothing left to lose could be the most dangerous opponent of all. Tonight, they would learn that lesson in the most public way possible. The Riverside County Charity Gala was held at the Grand Ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel, a venue that Porter Construction had renovated 3 years earlier as part of a tax write-off scheme that I now knew was likely fraudulent. 500 of the county's most influential citizens filled the elegant space. Politicians, business leaders, judges, and media personalities all gathered to celebrate another year of charitable giving and community service. I arrived wearing my best suit, the same one I'd worn to that first dinner at the Porter estate, but tonight I felt different. Tonight, I wasn't the humble guest grateful for an invitation to their world. Tonight, I was a man with a mission. Maggie squeezed my hand as we entered the ballroom. "You don't have to do this, Frank. We could still walk away." "No, we couldn't," I replied softly. "Not anymore." The recording device taped to my chest was barely noticeable beneath my shirt, and the evidence files were secure in Carter's hands. Around the room, I spotted several off-duty officers mingling with the crowd, their presence a comforting reminder that I wasn't facing this alone. Richard Porter stood near the front of the room, resplendent in a custom tuxedo and surrounded by admirers. He was in his element, wealthy, powerful, and seemingly untouchable. When he spotted me across the room, his smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Blake Porter was nearby, his arrogance on full display as he regaled a group of young socialites with stories of his latest expensive toys. He looked like someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions, an oversight I was about to correct. "Frank!" Richard Porter approached with his arms spread wide, as if greeting an old friend. "I'm so glad you could make it tonight. How's Evan recovering?" "He's healing," I replied evenly. "Bruises fade. Some lessons last forever." Porter's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Indeed they do. I hope tonight's festivities will help put recent unpleasantness behind us." "Oh, I think tonight will be very educational for everyone involved." Before Porter could respond, the evening's master of ceremonies called for everyone to take their seats. The program was scheduled to begin with dinner, followed by speeches from various community leaders, and culminating with Porter receiving the Humanitarian of the Year award. I was seated at a table near the back of the room, strategically positioned to have a clear view of the stage and easy access to the exits. Carter sat 2 tables away, and I could see Paula near the media section, ready to ensure that everything was properly documented. The dinner conversation around my table was the usual mixture of business gossip and social pleasantries. I participated minimally, my attention focused on the evening's main event. As dessert was served, the master of ceremonies took the stage to begin the formal program. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the annual Riverside County Charity Gala. Tonight, we celebrate the generosity and community spirit that makes our county a wonderful place to live and work." The speeches began with the mayor discussing various municipal projects, followed by the county commissioner praising local business leaders. I listened with growing disgust, knowing that several of the officials on stage had been bought and paid for by the man they were about to honor. Finally, the moment arrived. It is my great pleasure to present this year's Humanitarian of the Year award to a man whose generosity and vision have transformed our community, Mr. Richard Porter. The applause was thunderous as Porter took the stage, his smile radiant with triumph. He accepted the Crystal Award with appropriate humility, then stepped to the podium to deliver his acceptance speech. "Thank you so much for this incredible honor," he began, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom's sound system. "When I first came to this county 30 years ago, I dreamed of building something lasting, something that would benefit generations to come." I felt sick listening to his words, knowing the truth about how he'd built his empire. but I waited, letting him dig his own grave with his arrogance. They say that success is measured not by what you accumulate, but by what you give back to your community. I've always believed that those of us who have been blessed with success have a responsibility to lift up those less fortunate. The irony was overwhelming. This man, who had put my son in the hospital for dating above his station, was lecturing the crowd about lifting up the less fortunate. In closing, I want to say that everything I've accomplished has been built on a foundation of integrity, hard work, and respect for the law. These values. That's when I stood up. The movement caught Porter's attention mid-sentence, and he paused, his eyes locking onto mine across the crowded ballroom. For a moment, the only sounds were clinking glasses and the rustle of expensive fabric. "Mr. Porter," I called out, my voice cutting through the sudden quiet. "Before you finish that thought about integrity and respect for the law, there's something this audience should hear." A murmur rippled through the crowd as heads turned. Confusion, curiosity, and dawning alarm spread across familiar faces. Porter's smile held. "Frank, whatever you have to say can wait until the program concludes." Actually, it can't. I stepped into the aisle, moving toward the stage. Mr. Porter has built his reputation on a lie, and tonight, the truth comes out. Security guards advanced, but Carter and his colleagues were already in position, badges visible as they blocked the guards. The murmuring grew louder. "I think you've had too much to drink," Porter said calmly, though his voice tightened. "Sit down before you embarrass yourself." I reached the front and turned to face the room. 500 of the county's most powerful people stared back at me. "My name is Franklin Mercer," I said. "1 week ago, I found my son severely injured on a logging road near Clearwater Lake. He was targeted because he fell in love with this man's daughter, and because he uncovered evidence of wrongdoing tied to Mr. Porter." The room erupted in shocked conversation, but I continued. "Richard Porter is not a humanitarian. He's a lawbreaker who bribed county officials, committed fraud, and used intimidation to protect his empire." Porter finally snapped. "This is outrageous! Security! Remove him!" Instead, Carter stepped onto the stage, badge raised. "I think everyone should hear this." Paula joined me, opening a laptop connected to the sound system. "You're about to hear recordings made in Mr. Porter's own office." Porter's voice filled the ballroom. "The 50,000 should secure his cooperation on the zoning change. Make sure it's untraceable." Silence. Blake Porter lunged for the stage, but 2 off-duty officers stopped him. "Fake recordings!" he shouted. Then the second file played, Blake's voice. "The boy needs to learn his place. A few broken ribs should do it." Gasps echoed as reporters raised phones and notebooks. "There's more," I said. "Bank records, fabricated environmental reports, and proof of witness intimidation." Agent Cross appeared with federal agents. "Richard Porter, Blake Porter, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, bribery, and assault." Chaos erupted. Porter's face twisted as the cuffs closed around his wrists. "This is a setup." "We can prove it," Paula said, holding up a thick folder, "with help from your own daughter." Natalie stepped forward, pale but steady. "I couldn't let you hurt anyone else." Clara Porter joined her. "I should have stopped this years ago." As father and son were led away, the crowd parted, cameras flashing. The most powerful man in the county walked out in handcuffs. I stood on the stage, thinking of Evan in his hospital bed, hurt for loving the wrong person and for uncovering the wrong truth. The last thing I saw was Porter's face as he disappeared. The arrogance was gone. What remained was the realization that not everyone can be bought, threatened, or silenced. And as the final evidence folder left my hands, the Porter empire collapsed, publicly, permanently, and on camera.